to the session on measuring women's labor force participation and some thoughts on the way forward. So at the outset, let me acknowledge that it's just two men talking about women's labor force participation, which is a bit ironical, but also it goes on to speak about the dedication of two of the organizations, gLOCAL as well as IWAGE, which is holding this discussion towards getting everyone engaged in this crucial topic. At the outset, let me start also by introducing the organizations holding, anchoring this discussion. So IWAGE, the Initiative for What Works to Advance Women and Girls in the Economy, is a research and advocacy organization which uses existing research as well as generates new evidence to find out what works rather than how to increase women's participation in the economy, their access to decent work, as well as what can be done towards addressing the economic as well as other challenges that restrain women from being in the labor force. IWAGE is an initiative of LEAD at Kriya University. LEAD is an action-oriented research center that uses the power of research, innovation, and collaboration to solve complex development issues. Since 2005, the center has been at the forefront of development research and programming in India and has had a portfolio of 265 projects across 300 academics, governments, and NGOs. At today's gLOCAL discussion, we'll be talking about two big challenges that we face when it comes to measuring women's work, especially in a context like India. And then we'll be talking about an interesting method that we recently tested to uncover the implicit bias that women face in the job market. The first presentation will be by me. I'm Parushya, a research manager at IWAGE. I look after research design as well as quantitative methods and analytics in multiple projects around urban informal economy, urban poverty, and social protection schemes. Joining me will be my colleague Karthikeya, who's a research associate at LEAD, and he's currently engaged with Solutions for Transformative Rural Enterprises and Empowerment, this free initiative that provides technical assistance to National Rural Livelihoods Mission, the Government of India. So before delving into the first part of presentation, let me just start by discussing why measuring women's work is something that's important. So women do constitute 50% of the yeah, just a bit of housekeeping. All participants can send questions in the chat and we'll be addressing them at the end of the two presentations. Yeah, so coming back to why measuring women's work, especially in a context like India, is important. Women do constitute 50% of population of countries. However, their representation in labor force is not so. And across the globe, women's participation has generally been lower than men's participation in the labor force. While it hinders women's access to to means of having decent quality of life as well as fulfilling their ambitions to work, it also has implications for any country's economy. And just to put things in context, a recent report by World Economic Forum had shown that even if men's participation and women's participation are equal, that is, women's participation is increased to the level where men's participation in labor force is, the GDP has a potential to rise by 27%. And while that puts forth why women's participation in labor force is important, it also highlights why measuring women's participation accurately and as precisely as possible is a strong need of the hour, because only that will highlight the gap that the current state of economy as well as what its potential could be can be filled in. So this presentation is based on a study that IWAGE did recently in 5 states of the country. And we tried some innovative methods we focused at answering, while some of the questions were that have been coming across through various studies. Also, we tried some new methods to find out how to accurately find that sampling frame, which a lot of us who are involved in monitoring and evaluation work know is a tedious job, is a cost constraint for a lot of us. So delving into this, the prompt that we started with, or the concern because of our work that we've come across, is that while female labor force participation has always been low, it has also been declining in India in the recent decades. And that has really worried the academicians, policymakers, and generally everyone interested in the state of the economy. The concerns about this issue can largely be classified into two sort of questions about the whole process of measuring women's participation. The first being, what keeps women from being in the workforce? That's the place where all the studies and all the discussions have been focusing on the structural issues, like unpaid work that is non-remunerative in nature and keeps women from joining the paid workforce. Then there are social norms, both at the level of household as well as workplaces, that actually either constrains women from going out of the house or stops them from joining workplaces. Inadequate skilling, the jobs not matching the skills. Care work, as we'll see in a later part of the presentation, that is towards primary child care, that inhibits women from taking time out to work. Lack of suitable job opportunities, and a more macroeconomic perspective from jobless service-led growth. The second part, which is actually entered the debate a bit more recently than the first part, is, are we capturing women's work well? Now that largely concerns about how do we define work? And is it an inclusive definition of work, or it gets muddled because the definition of work is seen to be a gender neutral sort of definition and doesn't take into account all sorts of work that women engage in. Then issues around surveys or large-scale studies, where it really matters who asks these questions about women's work, who responds. Is it the women themselves, or is it some other member of the household? And also, lastly, how responses are probed. So with these two sort of points in mind, we started the study somewhere around November last year, 2021, and focused on two aspects, which is who to ask the questions about women's work and how to ask them. Starting with the who to ask aspect, it really becomes important that, of course, we have to ask women, but how do we get a sample that's representative, that is covers all different strata, socioeconomic strata of society, that captures heterogeneity, especially that we see in the urban areas, different caste groups, different class groups, that facilitates efficient approach to working age women, that is 18 to 59 years of age. And that point really leads to the cost point in any sort of monitoring and evaluation studies. As the next point says, in resource and time constraint framework. And of course, as all of us know, it got a bit worse because of situations like pandemic, where access or usual activities like household listing before the survey were really not possible. So IWAGE FLF is the female labor force study, used publicly available data. We're going to come to that. We use spatial juxtaposition. That is how we try to sample by using different maps. We sampled more urban women, again, to capture the heterogeneity. And we were able to sample working age women in a more targeted, more cost-effective, time-effective manner. So the snapshot on the right side shows what we did in brief. We selected states. I'm going to come to how we selected states. We selected the state, and then we selected a rural district and an urban district with them. Within those districts, we selected something called constituencies, the assembly constituencies, which send legislators to the state legislative assemblies. Why we did so? Because that enabled us to get electoral rolls, which is basically voter list at a very micro level, at the level of a ward or a small unit. And we were able to get accurate addresses as well as ages of people enrolled there. How we selected the states, we didn't want to focus on just a particular sort of state where the female labor force participation might have been high. So we actually selected 5 states with contrasting trends of FLFPR and different trends of incline or decline. As you can see, Madhya Pradesh, Delhi, Jharkhand, Rajasthan, and Karnataka. So once we selected these states, what we did was we mapped out all the districts with their urban population ratio. As a case in point, you see here of Madhya Pradesh. We basically plotted the distribution and chose the district with the highest population in the fourth quartile of urban population ratio, which in case of Madhya Pradesh was Indore, and the district with the highest population in the first quartile, which was Riva, to select as our urban and rural districts. Why we chose the districts with the highest population? Because that also allowed us to have access to a wider and a bigger sampling frame. Once we selected the districts, this was the interesting part. We took out the district maps, which the Census Handbook of India provides, and that shows where the major population centers in a district are. As you can see on the map on the left, there are these big red dots at the center of the district Indore, and that overlapped with the assembly constituency Rao within the district of Indore. Once we selected Rao, we got access to all the polling booths where people go to vote at the level of that assembly constituency. And then we selected polling booths, digitized their voter lists, and we were able to focus on females of age group 18 to 59 in a more targeted manner. So once we did that, we were able to conduct our surveys about workforce participation and different aspects of constraints and enablers. Just to sort of sanity check, we also compared our sample, the final sample that we got, with other more representative, nationally representative studies. And some of the figures, as you can see here, our age pyramids were similar to what we see in most nationally representative surveys. Our dependent variable, which is the workforce participation, the top panel on the right shows an inverted U pattern when compared with age. Secondly, with education, which has been discussed a lot about in a lot of labor force literature, shows an dropout rate, which is higher in educated females. Again, a validation that this sort of sampling, this sort of a targeting of just female respondents works and also is cost effective at the same time. Similarly, when it comes to workforce participation across wealth groups or asset groups, we saw that workforce participation of urban women in extreme asset groups, which is the lowermost decile and the highermost decile, is higher. So with these sort of validations, we were comfortable to say that this sort of sampling, this sort of targeting was worthwhile, cost-effective, time-effective, and can actually find women who constitute a sample which is representative of all sections of society, class-wise, caste-wise, age group-wise. This was one innovation we did, and it focuses on the aspect that we spoke about in the first slide, that who answers, and we have seen in a lot of nationally representative surveys which are at the level of household, that it's also males who are reporting about females' work. So we, for 20% of our households, we actually did 2 surveys. Each one was with a female member and one was with a male member. The male household instrument, male survey instrument was smaller, but captured female work engagement, male work engagement, female time activity budget, and housework and care responsibility norms. And then we compared the workforce participation rates as reported by females versus as reported by males. We found that there's no statistically significant difference between the 2 rates. However, we also found that there is difference between the perceptions about household and care responsibilities. So we can actually explore a question in our further studies, or whoever's doing that what happens when the respondent is self-reporting versus when there's proxy reporting. The second part of our framework was about how to ask, and this was a vital part in understanding that why female labor force participation rates might be low, because a simple answer could be that we were just counting women in most other surveys who were employed in paid or profit work. So what we did was we also other than paid work, we also included women who worked in supporting role. That is, they supported their family or husband in any sort of economic activity. We also asked if women were looking for any paid work opportunities, self-employment. This actually feeds into more traditional definition of labor force. And we also asked questions about willingness to work. The table on the right shows some of the figures to compare that what happens when we include just paid work, which is the column on the left. The second column talks about women who are working for pay, plus also women who are not working for pay but are supporting any paid work in the family. So you see that across the board, there's an increase in the count of women who are involved in any sort of activity that leads to economic productivity for the household. And similarly, the third definition, workforce participation rate, plus looking for work, that number further increases. How we did that? We used this probing framework. Rather than just stopping and asking whether the woman was working for pay or profit, we also asked what factors she considered while choosing for work. Will they prefer self-employed work, and what are the challenges they face in self-employment? Similarly, if they answered no, they are not working for pay or profit, we captured whether they were willing to work, and if they were willing to work, whether they were actively looking for work. So with this sort of probing framework, we also got some new definitions of what we can call as work, what we can call as underutilized potential in the labor force. And just an aggregate figure here, the workforce participation rate, that is women who are just working for pay, on an average stands at around 27%. But once we add the women who are looking for work to this number, we get a figure close to 35%. And once we look at the women who are also willing to work, that number goes up to 70%. So there are a number of inferences that can be made from this particular finding. That first being that just looking for paid work actually underestimates the labor force. Second being that it's not that women are not willing to work or that they are not looking for work. It might actually be that suitable jobs are not available in a sort of framework that helps them overcome the norms or barriers that they have. And that brings me to the next part, where we also ask women how much time they spend on household work and how much time they spend on employment work, labor-related activities, without much reference to whether they were paid for it. So this time activity budget, we actually explored in a manner where we asked whether you are working in own enterprise, whether you're working in family enterprise, without even mentioning that whether you are being paid for it. Similarly, we also took a quantum of how much time on an average they're spending on household work, which involves a bunch of activities from meal preparation to childcare to elderly care. And just a brief snippet of one of our findings from this time budget activity, that women working for pay actually reported 30 more minutes of total activity on an average day than others. That is, the women who are not working in paid work. And as you can see, the other panel shows that this gap exists due to working women spending significantly more time on paid work, although less time is spent on childcare and domestic chores. This kind of highlights that women who are working do not have as much of a, like they do have a difference in household work, but it's not as big as the difference between employment or labor-related work. Lastly, in that probing framework, we also asked women who were not in the workforce, who had dropped out, that what constrains them, and also for women in the workforce, what actually supports their decision to be in the workforce. So as you can see on the plots on the left, the top right, it's about women who have dropped out of the workforce. Household-related barriers were major factors, getting married, having children, and household chores and responsibilities being some of the major factors for both urban and rural women. Similarly, once you look at the panel at the bottom, we see that women who are in the workforce actually feel that not having any interference from housework or care responsibilities enables them to be in the workforce. So that again highlights the structural issue we spoke about initially, that there's a lot of unpaid work, there's a lot of primary care duties that actually either stops women from being in the workforce, or the absence of such duties or having a support system helps women be in the workforce. Lastly, one of our findings with related to workplace-related barriers being that flexible work timings, workplace being close to home are some of the biggest enablers for women to be in the workforce. We also asked women about how far away do they go to work, whether by transport or by walking, and on an average, women take up jobs which are 20 to 25 minutes away. So that also puts forward a point that having an enabling infrastructure, transport-related infrastructure, might be something that the policymakers can focus on. So just to summarize this, by this change in the method of who to ask, while of course we save time, we save costs from a monitoring and evaluation and survey-related perspectives, we also got a more targeted approach to understanding what women's willingness to work is, what percentage of women are actually looking for work but not being able to find, and by changing definitions of work and then further probing what were their reasons for not being in the workforce, what were the reasons for being able to take work, we were able to also disaggregate what sort of barriers, like household related, work related, what actually constitutes the major factors affecting women's participation. So with that, I want to hand over to Karthikeya, who's going to speak about an interesting experimental module that was done alongside this study. Karthikeya, over to you.
Thanks, Purusha. Hello, everyone. My name is Karthikeya, and I'm a researcher at the Small Growing Businesses and Employment vertical here at Leeds University. I will be talking briefly about our research on the enterprise survey that we conducted, sort of complementing the household survey that iWage conducted. We were hoping to answer questions on the demand side enablers and constraints to the female labor force participation in India. Of course, we stuck to just the enterprises, which are the large, outside agriculture, the largest source of employment for women in India. Could you go to the next slide, please? So our data was collected through in-person surveys, which took place from December 2021 through February 2022. Our objective was to understand the worker skill demand and documenting implicit and explicit gender biases by enterprise owners that may affect women's hiring prospects. Our survey locations were 4 districts in 2 states, and here again, similar to the iWage survey, we took a purposive sample of states. So Karnataka was a high density enterprise state, and Jharkhand was a low density enterprise state. And within these states, we ensured a mix of urban and rural districts, similar to the methodology that has been already described by Purusha. So I won't go much into it, but we took our sampling frame actually from the district industry center, present in each of the district covered in our study. The lists provided by the DICs are one of the most exhaustive sources of formal and semi-formal enterprises registered within the district. And we randomly drew from this sampling frame a list of enterprises, and we stratify based on industry type, manufacturing, trading, and services. Now, the final sample was 1,238 respondents. 90% of the entrepreneurs were male and 10% were female. This is comparable to nationally representative data sets as well, like EC and the economic census and the national sample survey 73rd round, with the caveat that we did not represent a lot of agricultural enterprises, which women are sort of represented well in. However, this presentation is actually concentrating on the experimental component. We had several themes in our study. These included hiring history, hiring processes, perception and preferences of entrepreneurs, which included an experimental component that I will now talk about in detail. Most hiring, just to provide the context, most hiring done by enterprises in India is through informal sources like word of mouth, and we verified this information through our study as well. So while many entrepreneurs show explicit hiring biases, for example, some entrepreneurs outrightly would say that they prefer a male candidate or a female candidate for a particular job, we wanted to understand if there are any implicit biases against some key worker characteristics in the job market. Can we go to the next slide, please? So typically in choice experiments in the field of electoral politics and labor markets, 2 hypothetical profiles are generated based on key characteristics like race, gender, income, etc. And using conjoint analysis, we measure the relative discrimination over one over another, because you have to sort of pick one profile out of whatever you're given. However, this is not the approach that we took. Just as an example, in the top left corner, this is from our back in Hachil. This is a study that was done I believe in Delhi, and it was about electoral politics and preferences of people. 2 profiles, similar looking profiles, were given to people, and the respondents were sort of choosing one over another. Now, this is not the method that we chose, and there are reasons for that. So first, we had to eliminate social desirability bias. So picking a male profile or a female profile over one another is an obvious example of social desirability bias, which we wanted to avoid. We also wanted to mimic the hiring process in micro and small scale enterprises in India, where hiring is done based on word of mouth and not exactly resumes or applications. We did not want responses to be relative to each other, but rather provide us with aggregate sentiment. Now, coming to what we ended up doing was that we randomly generated. Let me go back to this, yeah. We randomly generated a single fictitious worker based on 4 characteristics: gender, marital status, education, and age. And of course, each characteristic had 2 choices based on which we were randomizing the profile. So the factorization of each of these would give us 32 unique profiles, which we would randomly generate in survey CTO. In the left bottom corner, you can see a few examples of the profiles that were generated like this. Now, we didn't actually present these profiles like visually to the respondents. We sort of administered it in a way. We can put the next slide, please. So the administration of the question was something like this. We would ask the entrepreneur, would they hire this worker? We contextualize the work according to the enterprise as well. So an example would be, would you hire this worker to help you out in your workplace for tasks like bookkeeping? And then we would read out each of the 4 characteristics. And then we would wait for the answer from the entrepreneur. If the answer was no, we would move on to other questions of the survey. If the answer was yes, we would also ask how much would you be willing to pay them monthly. And we sort of we asked this because we also intended to study wage disparities based on some characteristics, and I can also talk about that in a bit. We also had some probing strategy in place because a lot of respondents would typically tell you that, I'm not hiring. And then we would sort of present them with a situation. Suppose you were hiring or replacing a worker you already have, would you hire this? And then ask the subsequent questions. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, coming to the preliminary findings of the experiment, we found that female profiles are 25% less likely to be hired than their male counterparts. Married profiles are 18% less likely to be hired than those profiles which are listed as unmarried. We did not find any conclusive evidence against attributes like age and gender. And we also tested for interactions across all the 4 variables and found no conclusive results. So for example, we wanted to understand, would a woman who is married would have a particular disadvantage? We found no conclusive results because of our limited sample, but this is an area of exploration. Beyond this, we also wanted to find whether any specific type of enterprises are discriminating against women. Can we go to the next slide, please? And we found that larger enterprises are less likely to discriminate against women, and smaller enterprises are more likely to discriminate against women. On a closing note, I want to stress that our approach is specific with a few key considerations. Hiring has other aspects. It includes negotiations, it includes interviews, even if they're informal. Moreover, even candidates do not apply to jobs in a random fashion. For example, women tend to go to look for jobs where women entrepreneurs are hiring. So more research can throw light on hiring in the labor market. However, policy implications point to incentivizing hiring of women in the labor market because the biases are conclusive. And I want to end the presentation on this note, and would be happy to take questions from the audience.
Thanks, Karthikeyan. I think we have a couple of questions here. Karthikeyan, if you could look at the question, I think the first one's for you.
Actually, in our experience, we found it pretty easy to administer these questions. Of course, there were hesitations at first because entrepreneurs were pretty. They double down on the fact that they're not looking to hire and will not be hiring in the near future. But since this is an experiment and since this is about hypothetical profiles, we sort of took a reroute, let's say, and said, if you were to hire the same person, just for context, all entrepreneurs covered in the study had at least one paid full-time employee. So this is sort of the pivot that we used to ask, okay, if you were to replace this worker, would you hire this person? And then we read the attributes.
Karthik's second question also, I think.
Second question, yes. So we did not actually find wage rate differentials, and this is again because of our limited sample. So if we go to the slide on the administration of the question on wage was asked once the entrepreneur says yes, I will hire them, and then then they were sort of given the question, and approximately 25%. I think a quarter of our sample actually had responded that yes, they would hire this worker, and then they were asked the question. So this actually limited our sample, and we were not able to find any conclusive evidence of any wage differential across the 4 variables.
I think we do have any more questions. We don't have any more questions. We've answered those questions. Okay. So if there are no more questions, so there's a question about how does our workforce figures participation rates compare with PLFS figures? PLFS is a periodic labor force survey for those who have joined it. So I think the way we measured the labor force figures were actually the workforce figures were higher than that measured by PLFS. And I think a lot of it also has to do with the sort of probing we did, rather than just asking them whether they're working for pay or not. We also went beyond that, and that actually led to a higher estimate of labor force.
There's one more question. And just reading it out, what was the reason behind sticking with one profile instead of a comparison profile? I think I answered it during the presentation, but let's revisiting it again. So as you know, our sample was already skewed. It was 90% male entrepreneurs, and presenting two profiles to them, the likelihood of social desirability bias was weighing in on our minds. Also considering in choice experiments, the difference between candidates is usually very subliminal. It's not as sudden as male and female. So we wanted to eliminate the social desirability bias first and foremost. We want, again, we wanted to sort of leverage this hiring process that is very common in enterprises in India, where hiring is based on word of mouth. So a limited set of characteristics are first told to the entrepreneur, and then the entrepreneur sort of responds to whether they would hire them or not. And of course, it involves a lot of other sort of follow-up. Perhaps it's wage negotiations, or perhaps it's interviews. But we just wanted to understand the employability at the get-go. We did not want to just responses to be relative to each other, but rather provide us with the aggregate sentiment that exists in the market. So I hope I answered the question.
Sure. Are there any more questions? Okay, there's one question about experience about using electoral rolls. Was there any challenges in reaching female respondents? So the challenges in using electoral rolls, I think while there were internal challenges in terms of being able to digitize these electoral rolls, because those who have worked with them know that they are in a non-text readable PDF format. So to say, that is a bit of a time-consuming process. But the definite advantage is because we use these electoral rolls over the other method, which is household listing, which is traditionally used by a lot of large-scale studies, which includes focusing on an area, doing a listing, a sort of a smaller survey with household counts and composition of the whole area, then using that as a sampling frame to randomize and select respondents that we're going to approach. So that really saved us a lot of time as well as cost in terms of creating that sampling frame. Another definite benefit of using electoral rolls, especially when you have to sample either a male or female respondent or a particular age group, is that these variables are actually present in the voter ID, which constitutes the electoral roll. So let's say for a hypothetical exercise, we have to get a sample within a particular 25 to 30 age group. It's quite easy to use electoral rolls to get that, rather than doing a household listing, which more than consuming time would also depend on reporting errors that can happen from the households. In terms of reaching female respondents, the general difficulties that most surveys find in terms of finding specific respondents, those were there, the respondents not being willing to. But I think this approach also gave us a bigger sampling frame with a number of replacements. So there was never a case where we were short of sampling, sampling where our sampling frame was actually short of respondents. So this, definitely ensures that we are able to reach whatever sample size we want to in a particular unit. So yeah, there were challenges, but when compared to the other alternative, we don't find any such major disadvantage. Okay, if electoral rolls are easy to access, why do you think most studies instead use traditional household listing? So, okay, there are two aspects to this answer. A partner organization had recently done a study of comparing household listing with electoral roll digitization. And they found that there were some particular categories which might not be listed, which might not be represented well in electoral rolls, especially people in the age group of 18 to 21, because that's also the time when people start getting enrolled. The other issue being in around 18 to 24 age group, women might be underrepresented or not well detailed in the electoral roll, because that's the age group where women migrate due to different reasons. So those are the two specific drawbacks which are going to hinder using electoral rolls. Other than that, I think a lot of times the sort of sample that is needed for specific studies is not always representative of a population. They might be, let's say, of another study, we want to get just parents who are enrolled in, whose kids are enrolled in government schools, or beneficiaries of particular programs. So in those cases, it's tough to use electoral roll. But in case of a random sampling at a population level, I think there are definite advantages, although there have been some studies which show that, as I said, a number of factors or a number of different classes, age-wise, gender-wise, and sometimes location-wise. For example, in urban areas, there's a higher chances of finding someone on the electoral roll but not being able to locate them. So I definitely don't have a clear answer about, but again, because a lot of studies are not always meant to be population representative, and that really puts the option of using electoral rolls out of question. Okay, I see we have more questions. We'd be happy to answer any more questions. Our details are available online on both the websites. So thank you all for your time and all of your questions, and for all our work and research and upcoming projects, you can always come to iwage.org to look for the different studies that are upcoming. And again, thanks a lot for being here, for your time and for your insightful questions. Thank you.